Actually, thank you. I don't know. All right, Shavosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. This is Chos Baruch Hashem to be able to begin another day of Avoda Zara. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, Tilson Mishpacha Varis Yisrael, for dedicating all the Shemar Joshos this year as a schus for Besaros Tovos for all of Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Av, Habba Alim Latova, Stephen Wendy Drazen, in honor of their parents, Israel Drazen, Dina Drazen, and Eileen Rosenzweig, and in memory of Stanley Rosenzweig, Zichron Livracha. Our week of learning sponsors, Abby and Joe Hirsch, with appreciation to the entire shir, to the Kehillah, and as a schos for the Chayalim and for those sacrificing for Klal Yisrael. We hope as well in the merit of our Talmud Torah that Amir Tzruch will bring home all of our hostages, b'shalom and b'karov, and allow our holy soldiers to be successful, b'chol ma'aseh yedehem. But with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, today's daf is Mem Aleph 41, and we are picking up on Mem Amud Beis 40b. 40b at the Tanur Rabbanan. So we kind of delved into a little bit, but we're picking up now again. It is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13 lines up from the end of the parak. From the end of the parak, so approximately 20 lines up from the bottom of the page, the Tanur Rabbanan. So I'll say with that, let us begin. A really incredible, and Rabbi Yaakov, is this your first day back since the babies? A special, if you don't know, Rabbi Yaakov Bornstein sitting in the back over here. Twin boys, Baruch Hashem, this past week. Mazel tov, Mazel tov. Rabbi Yaakov, such a chutzpah. He was learning in the hospital. I have pictorial proof. Baruch Hashem, Rabbi Yaakov, welcome back. And you should be zocha to be machnis your sons lebrisa shalom avinu bizmanom, and the God lom l'torah l'chuppah l'maisim tovim. Mazel tov, Mazel tov. Now let us begin. Tanur Rabbanan. Pamachas chash Rebi memeyav. One time, Rebi had now literally chash memeyav means he had some stomach issues. I mentioned yesterday's daf. Rebi had severe intestinal issues, severe stomach issues, which ultimately led to his demise. This was the famous story of where Rebi, the Talmidim of Rebi, or the Jews of his town, were davening for his refuah. His maidservant saw the terrible suffering. There was this tug between heaven and earth. Ultimately, again, who is going to retain Rebi? But this is earlier on in his illness. Pam achas chashay memeyav. One time, Rebi had stomach issues. Amar, klum yesh adam sheodea yayin tapuchem sha'ovdei kochavim asra amuta. So interestingly enough, apparently Rebi understood that the remedy for his illness, ultimately again was going to be yayin tapuchem, was going to be apple wine. So again, but he didn't know, is apple wine mutter or aser? Amar the father Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi said, well, pam achas chash abba b'meyav. So Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi said, one time my father also had stomach issues, and what happened? And they brought him aged wine, 70-year aged wine. I shouldn't call it wine. Apple wine, which I will say, of course, is essentially apple cider, fermented apple juice. It's not wine. So they called the yain tapuchim because they called it apple wine, but they brought before him aged, 70-year aged apple wine of Ovdei Kochavim, V'shasa v'nisrape, and he drank it and he was healed. So now again, remember, so Rebi having this stomach issue, asking, is this apple wine kosher or not? Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi saying, my father suffered from this same thing, and Baruch Hashem was able to go ahead and procure some of this apple wine and was healed. Amar lo, kol kach hava biyadecha. So Rebi essentially says, Rebi says to Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi, you had this information this entire time and you didn't share it with me. In other words, apparently Rebi was saying, I'm suffering over here. I'm suffering. You have this information and you failed to share it with me. So they found the merchant, they found an Oved, a particular Akum, who had in his storehouse 300 barrels of aged apple wine, of 70-year aged apple wine. Rebi was able to procure it from him. V'shasa, he drank it, v'nisrape, and he was healed. Now, of course, again, healed in this context doesn't mean forever, but obviously, again, just at least episodically, Rebi was healed from his ailment. It's supposed to be an incredible story. The Gemara now, obviously, for our purposes, remember, how do we get into this? Because the Gemara was discussing, can you buy apple wine from an akum? So obviously the answer from here, the Gemara says, is yes, you can buy apple wine from an akum. Rebi again saying, Baruch hamakom shemasar olamo l'shomrim. Now we'll say this is very interesting end of the Gemara. So Rebi says, Baruch hamakom, blessed is Hashem, who gave over his world to those who store stuff, right? So we'll say, so what does this mean? In other words, Baruch Hashem, the akum, had stored the wine. Because had he not stored the wine, because remember again, apparently from this Gemara, what you see over here is, it's not just stam apple wine, it's aged apple wine, right? 70-year aged apple wine. So Rebi was saying, Baruch Hashem, that there are people who store stuff. So first of all, keep this Gemara, because the next time someone who may or may not be married to you asks you to clean stuff out, right? You can say, look, Baruch HaMakom, right? Baruch HaMakom Shemasar, Baruch HaMakom Shemasar Alamu L'Shomrim. Okay, so apparently, again, there is merit to holding on to stuff, right? So the Gemara says, so Rebi was so thankful that this akum had held on to certain things for a prolonged amount of time. And we'll say, so there happens to be a lot of discussion about whether or not, is there like a bracha like this? Is this actually like a type of bracha? But I just want to point out how beautiful this is. Just this formulation, Baruch HaMakom Shemasar Olamo L'Shomrim. Leaving aside the actual subject, I'll say, it's interesting. The lashon of shmira. The lashon of shmira is a fascinating lashon. What does it mean to, shamar means to guard or to watch. Where's the first time that we find this expression in the Gemara? Ultimately, again, we find it in by Yaakov Avinu. When Yosef told over his dreams, so the pasuk says, Vayikanu bo echov, his brothers got very upset, literally again, jealous, upset. Va'aviv shamar es hadavar. And ultimately, again, his father guarded it. And Rashi points out over here, what does it mean his father guarded it? Yoshev u'mitzape masai yavo. That lashon of shmir, so literally again, Yoshev, he sat, Mitzape anticipated when would the dream come to actualization. Meaning that the lashon of shmira ultimately means to eagerly anticipate, to eagerly await the actualization of something. That's Yaakov Avinu understood that what Yosef was foretelling was actual nevuah, was actual visions of grandeur. Yaakov couldn't say anything at the moment because it would have awakened just animosity amongst his children. But he sat there eagerly anticipating, ultimately again, when is this going to come true? And perhaps this formulation of Abosai, Baruch HaMakom Shemasar Olamo L'Shomrim. Blessed are you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because at the end of the day, who holds the world in their hands? Those who are shomrim, those who eagerly anticipate the incredible things that are going to unfold for Klal Yisrael. Baruch HaMakom Shemasar Lam L'Shomrim. And I will say, this is such a profound Gemara to learn during these days. The 9 days in general are overwhelming days. They're overwhelming days historically. And the truth is, I don't know, maybe it's because it's the 9 days, or maybe it feels a little bit like when you read the headlines coming out of Eretz Yisrael now. It feels, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just a little bit of, like they call it, I guess, like war fatigue or whatever, which sounds strange for us to have war fatigue 6,000 miles away. But it feels almost as if things are getting worse and not better. Especially now, once again, you see all of the headlines about, famine in Gaza, and again, famine is tragic, but it's amazing how quickly the world loses sight about why we are in this predicament. It's very simple. Give back the hostages, disarm a terrorist entity, and everyone can have all the food that they need, and there's no more problems. The problem is not a problem created by Israel. The problem is a problem that was created on October 7th, and there's a simple remedy for it. The sheer volume of human suffering that is unfolding. It is unfolding, but it's not unfolding because of us. We're reacting to evil that was perpetrated upon us, and you see it, and it seems so pashut, and it seems so obvious, but yet the world just refuses to see it. and that France comes along and says that it's going to recognize a Palestinian state, Rishayim Gimurim. So what are you doing, aiding and abetting and fueling animalistic, terroristic behavior? How do you go to sleep at night? Some people need a few more slaps, how do you live with you? How do you understand what side of history are you putting yourself on? And so sometimes you see it and you're like, what's going on over here? What is this? What is this? And I don't know what it is. I never took current events like personally. I really take current events personally. And when you see these things, you really feel tremendously slighted and hurt, like pained over it. And then Rebi comes along and says, don't worry. Baruch hamakom shemasar olamo l'shomrim. Don't worry. We're shomrim. We're shomrim. What's Klal Yisrael? Yoshev u'mitzap masayavo. Just wait. We're shomrim. We're patient people. We wait to see the actualization of the most incredible and beautiful things. Yaakov Avinu was a shomer, right? Va'aviv shomer as hadavar. We b'nei Yaakov, we b'nei Yisrael have that same exact koach as well. We have staying power, we have patience, and we have the ability to watch to see how incredible and beautiful and holy things will unfold. They always have, and in Meretz Hashem, they always will. Baruch hamakom shenasan olamo l'shomrim, Rabbi say, is the most incredible bracha of chizuk, a statement of chizuk that Meretz Hashem will carry us even through the overwhelming circumstances. These words have carried us, and they will continue to carry us Meretz Hashem until the great day that Mashiach comes. And we'll say, let's go back there. V'chein the truma. Let's finish up the parak. V'chein the truma. So I'm v'chein the truma. So we'll say, what does it mean also for truma? Rav Sheshes, v'chein the kohen hachashad limkar truma l'shem chulin. So the Gemara says, this is very interesting. The same is true, ultimately, again, for a kohen, ultimately, again, who is suspect about selling truma and labeling it as chulin. So I'll say, so remember again, this is actually quite interesting to contemplate. A kohen, right? A kohen has truma. Kohen wants to sell the truma. What's the problem with selling truma? What's the problem with selling truma? You always have to sell it at a discount, right? Why? Because there's a much more limited customer base, right? So if you can only sell it to other Kohanim, so by definition, the Kohanic consumer has the advantage. So sometimes, unfortunately, you might have a Kohen shopkeeper who is unfortunately selling truma but labeling it as chulin. So the Gemara says like this: if you have a guy who has, now again, obviously a Kohen is not suspect to do that, but let's say you do have a Kohen who is suspect to do that. So what do you do? So the Gemara says, lefanav hu da'aser. It's only from the stuff that he's selling, like in his basket in front of him. Ultimately, again, that's aser. So we'll say the same idea that we saw before. The akum is suspect when he's selling certain things in front of him. That's when we're concerned that he may be sprinkling some wine. The stuff in storage is totally fine. There's specifically listed items that we had before. So too with a Kohen who's suspected of selling truma as chulin. The stuff that he has in front of him, ultimately, again, that is suspect. But ultimately, aval haba mina otsar umina hefsek umina salula. Now it changes the agos that's yunim changes the salula ultimately to sfina, because salula means basket. Basket's right in front of him. The stuff that he has in storage, mutter. We're not concerned that he's selling that as chulin. Rather, we assume that he's still treating that and selling it as truma. Why? Savar, the Gemara says, Ersuse mirsas, because he, like the akum, is concerned. He's scared. Savar shami be'rabanon umafsidel ininoi. He's concerned that the stuff that I have in storage, which is my volume, if the rabbis hear that I am selling chulin, I'm selling truma as chulin, what are they going to do? They're going to take away my produce from me, and I'm going to lose everything. Okay, so similar halacha over here by the Kohen. Now again, I just want to be clear. This is not by a stam Kohen. A stam Kohen has a cheskes kashrus. This is by a Kohen who we know, unfortunately, has a reputation of selling truma as chulin. The stuff that he has in front of him, like in the basket in the front of the store, that's going to be aser, but the stuff in storage is going to be mutter. Hadrun aloch ein ma'amidin. Mazel tov, mazel tov, mazel tov. Okay, Rabbi say new parak. Okay, that was 3 seconds of celebration. Now let's move forward. Okay, good. We'll say kol atzlamim asur ne'shein ne'evadin pam achas b'shan d'Reb Meir. So we'll say next. Slumim. Rabbi say, so now this is a really interesting sugya. Atzelim, Rabbi say, is an image, right? Now, interestingly enough, contemporarily, the word tselem could often mean an actual idol, an Avoda Zara idol, or an icon, like a cross or something. Here in this context, a tselem just literally means an image. Now, what we're going to see is, we don't know if the image was used for Avoda Zara or not. That's the point. So the Gemara says, Kol hatzlamim asurim bahana. So again, if you come across an image, you find an image, you cannot get any benefit from it. Why? Because we have to assume ultimately, again, Meir says, every image is worshipped at least once a year. So Rabbi Meir comes from the perspective that pretty much whenever you find an image, that is Avoda Zara. You have to assume it's Avoda Zara because you have to assume it's worshipped at least once a year, and therefore it is Aser Ba'ana. The Chum say no, Eino Aser, Ela Kol Sheyesh Biyado. This is very interesting. Kol Sheyesh Biyado Makel O Tzipor O Kadar. The Chum say it's not true. If you find an image, then the Maisa again, only if the image is holding something in its hand. For example, a staff, a bird, or a qadr means like a replica of the earth. If it's a replica of the earth, then that's indicative that it has some type of idolatrous import. But just the stam image, the Rabbanan say, ultimately again, that you don't have to assume it's Avoda Zara. Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Af Kol Sheyesh Biyado Kol Dar. Rabbi Shmuel says it's not just one of these aforementioned items, like a staff, a bird, or a round shape of the earth, but rather again, if the image itself is holding anything in its hand, ultimately, again, that is indicative that it's Avoda Zara. Okay, so we'll say, let's analyze this a little bit. What's going on over here? Says the Gemara. So let's remember again, what was the first halacha in Mishnah? Really, the only halacha in Mishnah. So again, I go ahead and I find an image. Yeah, we'll say, I'm walking down the street, I find the image. Yeah, okay, like right, good. This is more like, think about this in the context of like a three-dimensional image almost, right? I find a statue of a person. Right, an image, right? So what happens? And now the Gemara says, so now Rabbi Meir says, you must assume it's Avoda Zara because it's worshipped once a year. The Chachamim said it's not Avoda Zara unless, of course, you find it holding something. It's holding something in its hand. So the Gemara says as follows. I understand. If it's indeed worshipped once a year, then it is Avoda Zara. If it's Avoda Zara, then what's the logic of the Rabbanan? Am Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef, Am Rabbi Yochanan, bimkomo Rabbi Meir. So we'll say, this is interesting. There were different local practices. In Rabbi Meir's city, ultimately, again, it was common that they worshipped all images at least once a year. But that was in Rabbi Meir's locale. For Rabbi Meir, the chayish l'mi'uta, Gazer Shamekamos. Atu Osamakom. Suppose you've seen this before. Rabbi Meir in general is choshesh for the miyut, right? He is concerned. He legislates even regarding a miyut, which means an occurrence that is improbable. He's choshesh for the miyut, even for the minority of circumstances. And therefore, since it was happening in his locale, he was gozer lest it happen in other locales as well. But the Rabbanon ultimately, again, who are not choshesh for the miut, right? The Rabbanon are not choshesh for the minority of circumstances, and therefore halacha l'maisa did not create a general gezerah. So we'll say, so this is quite fascinating. So again, so I just want to point out over here, you're finding an image. You don't know if this image is Avoda Zara image or not. Rabbi Meir says, since in one place, namely in his hometown, they did worship all images at least once a year, Rabbi Meir says, therefore we have to be gozer on all images. All images, therefore you come across an image, you have to assume it's Avoda Zara, and therefore again, Aser Ba'ana. Why Rabbi Meir is choshesh for the miut, for the minority of possibilities. The Rabbanon, not choshesh for miyut. So therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, it's quite possible that it's not Avoda Zara at all. Now, I want to point out over here, I just want to mention this because you'll say yourself, well, I understand, it doesn't make any sense. Shouldn't it be a safek daraisa? Right, and safek daraisa l'chumra. So we're going to see really it's a svek sveka, it's a double safek. So double safek. So safek number one is was it Avoda Zara altogether? In other words, is it Avoda Zara? And even if it was made for Avoda Zara, was it ever actually worshipped as Avoda Zara? Because as we're going to see, something really doesn't attain Avoda Zara notoriety until it's actively worshipped. So according to Rabbi, you really have what we call a svek, a double safek. Was it actually created for Avoda Zara? And if it was created for Avoda Zara, was it actually ever worshipped? In a svek, a double safek, even in a daraisa, even in a biblical law, you could still go ahead and be meko. So that's coming attractions, but that's the logic over here. So let's analyze a bit more. I'm Rabbi Shmuel. Ba'andarti shal malachim shaninu. So Shmuel now comes along and he qualifies this a little bit more. What kind of images are we talking about? We're talking about the image of the king. Look at Rashi. Andarti kishamelech meis oset surasa bepesach ashar lezikaron v'hasim kam Rabbi Meir da'agav chavivusa palchile. So Shmuel comes along and says, it would be common when a king would die, they would often make his image on the gates of the city. So the Gemara says that. So Shmuel says that's what we're talking about over here, because it was common for people to worship that image, kind of like in deference to the king. Ultimately, again, we're talking about when Rabbi Meir talks about answering all of these images, he's talking about, again, the images that are stationed at the entranceway of the city. Okay, Rashi points out, Rabbi Meir good. Memal from 41a. Amar Machlokes b'shel kfarim. Furthermore, the machlokes is only regarding the images of villages. But when it comes to the images of large cities, divrei hakol mutarin. Everyone agrees it's mutar. Why? My taima linoi avdiloi. Because again, this is very interesting. In the small villages, when there were images were almost always religious in nature, and therefore Allah you have to assume it's Avoda Zara. Or at least that's the machlokes, in the Chachamim. But in the big cities, it was common to make these images just simply lanai. Lanai means for decorative purposes, and therefore everyone would agree that if you find these images in the large city, ultimately, again, it is mutar. Gemara says, 1 second. Now, the way the Gemara just framed it was, in the villages, that's the machlokes Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. Rabbi Meir says in the villages it's for Avodah Zara, and the Chachamim say no, it's for decorative purposes. The Gemara says, really? Does anyone hold that in the villages it's not religious in nature? The Gemara says, the kfarim vaday lemiflechinu avdilahu. In the villages, certainly again, when the common people and the regular people made these images, they made it to pray to, right? They made it for theological, for religious purposes. Ella. Itmar hachi itmar. I think here's what you have to say. Rabbi said as follows: Machlokes b'shel krachim. No. The machlokes between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim ultimately is in the cities. Rabbi Meir says you have to assume that every image is worshipped at least once a year, and therefore any image, even in the cities, ultimately again is going to be Avodah Zara. The Chachamim say no in the cities. Unless, of course, you know that it's idolatry, you could assume that it's decorative, and therefore that it's mutar. Aval b'shel kfarim. But everyone agrees that in the villages, divrei hakol asurim. Everyone agrees ultimately again that it is going to be asur, because in the villages they certainly create these images for religious purposes. Okay, incredible. We'll say now that's the first part of the Mishnah. Second part of the Mishnah was the Chachamim agree with Rabbi Meir that certain images are always considered to be religious in nature. What are those images? So again, according to the Chachamim, it's the images of a person, right, holding on to something. So again, in the Mishnah's examples, it was a person holding on to a staff, a bird, or the earth. So it says, let's analyze. So now, what's the significance of all of those things? So the Gemara says, what's the symbolism if you find an image of a person holding on to a staff? What's the importance of that? So let me translate the words and then explain to you how the Gemara phrased it. Literally translated, it means, what does the staff represent? That the image subjugates himself underneath the world like a staff. Now we'll say, so just to point out what's happening over here, the Gemara does not want to refer to Avodah Zara in a positive way. So the way that the Gemara refers to it as the Avodah Zara itself as the subjugated force. Right? But really what the Gemara means to say is like this: when the image is holding onto a staff, what does a staff represent? Staff represents rulership. By the way, Lo Yasser Shevet Mi Yehuda umechokek mi bein raglav ad ki yavo shilo v'lo yikasamim. The scepter, right? Yaakov in Parshas Vayechi, the scepter shall not go ahead and leave Yehuda. So the staff represents monarchy, represents rulership. So therefore, again, if the image is holding a staff, that means that the image, right? The image is supposed to give off the theological message that it's ruling over the world. Okay, that's the significance of a staff. Next. Sipor, what's the significance if the image is holding on to a bird? Shetofes es atzmo tachas kol ha'olam kitsipor. Just as like when one holds a bird, right? About say if you capture a bird, I guess if you capture a bird, right? You hold the bird is totally enveloped by your hand. It represents again dominion. So too when the image holds the bird in his hand, it represents dominion over the world. Kador, what about the globe in his hand? Shetofes es atzmo tachas kol ha'olam kulo kikador. Ultimately, again, literally holds the earth in the palm of its hand. So obviously, according to the Chachamim, if you find an image with any of these three things that represents a sense of dominion, anytime an image is made with dominion, that is clearly Avoda Zara. Okay, incredible. Tano. So remember again, they added on now, the Brisa says, they added on a few more things that if the image is holding also represent Avoda Zara. Hosifu alein, saif, a sword, atara, a crown, taba'as, a ring. Saif, there's a very interesting word, it says saif, sword, meikara savar, listim ba'alma. So in the beginning they thought, what does it mean when you see an image with a sword? What does an image with a sword represent? It represents a robber. But then they realized, that no, the import of a lubasov savar shahoriges asmotachas kala olam kulo. That literally it represents the ability of the image to kill the world. In other words, once again, power. Atara, if the image has a crown, meikara savar gadol klili ba'alma. So they thought at first maybe it just meant that this is a person, an image of a person who made crowns. Ulubasov savar katar lamelech. Then they understood, no, the crown represented monarchy. Tabas, ring, meikara savar ishtaima ba'alma. They thought maybe it was just the messenger of someone who often carries the signet ring of his master. Ulubasov savar shechosim es atzmo tachas kol ha'olam kula lemisa. Then they understood that no, it theologically represented someone who had the ability to literally seal the world for a certain verdict. Okay, so as I said, obviously the theme over here is the Chum making a fundamental distinction between the image of someone, right, as image, versus an image with an object, the object representing a sense of power and dominion. Incredible. Okay, well, let's go back there. Rabbi Shmuel says as follows. So Rabbi Shmuel said, anything that the image is holding ultimately represents Avoda Zara. So the Gemara says, Tana, afilu tsrar, afilu kisam. So interestingly enough, even if the image is holding a pebble or a piece of wood, a little piece of wood. In other words, so whereas the Chachamim were saying, and the Brisa we just quoted before said, the object that is held by the image has to at least symbolically represent some level of rulership and dominion. Shmuel says, no, the importance is not really in what it's holding, but rather, again, the importance is that it's holding something. The act of holding on to something, by definition, represents some degree of rulership. Okay, incredible. So we'll say, interesting question the Gemara ends off with. First wide line, by Rav Ashi, Tafas biyadot soa. Okay, what happens if the image is holding excrement? Holding excrement. All right, so the Gemara says, Mahu, what does that represent? So the Gemara says, Mahu, miar minar, kuli alma zilu ba'ape kitsa. On one hand, maybe it can mean like this, that the image is kind of portraying this message. The whole world is as worthless to me as a piece of excrement. In other words, so what the image is supposed to represent is a powerful entity that in its eyes, the world is like nothing. The world is mamish like a piece of excrement. Or Ikeda I'm sorry. The other possibility is, or maybe whoever made the image is trying to convey a different message, which is the entity represented in this image is as worthless to us as a piece of excrement. Okay, to which the Gemara says, Teku, we're not sure. We're not sure exactly what the symbolism of that particular image is, and therefore the Gemara leaves it. Okay, beautiful. Mishnah, Hamotzi Shirei Slamim. So we'll say another interesting case over here. Person finds broken pieces of an image. Right, so there was an image. I now come across a broken piece of an image. So what's the halacha? Hare elu mutarin. Ultimately, again, they are mutter. Now we'll say, now why are they mutter? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi is the first short line in Rashi. Taimim Farsh Gemara. So we're going to see the reason for this in the Gemara. Techi havu shleimim safek lo avdum. V'mtim salomar avdum eimar bitlum lekach shivram have a svek seka bekula. Once again, about to have a svek seka. What's a svek seka? So I find a piece of an image. So what is it? So the Gemara says it's a double suffix. Suffix number one is that was this ever an Avoda Zara image or not? Right. So perhaps it was never idolatry. That's number one. Even if it was that, Shmuel says, we're going to get into this, fascinating, there's a concept of bittul by idolatry. Now, not classic bittul like you're thinking about, where an item gets mixed in with a bunch of other things. Bittul means an akum could negate his idolatry. How could he negate his idolatry? If he smashes it. Now, we're going to see smashing is not the only way to do it, but essentially, you could decommission idolatry. Now, interesting, only an idolater can decommission idolatry. So there's two possibilities over here. Number one, maybe it was never Avoda Zara. And number two, even if it was Avoda Zara, maybe it was decommissioned, right? It's batal because the Oved Kochavim went ahead and smashed it. Therefore, again, that is a svek, a double suffix, and therefore the double suffix ultimately makes it mutter. Incredible. So again, fine. That's the first halakha of the Mishnah. Next, this is very interesting. Matzah tavnis yad o tavnis regel hare elu asurim. So what happens? We'll say if you find the image of a foot or the image of a hand. So the halacha is these are asur. These are asur. Why are these asur? Mipnei shekiyotze bahen ne'evad. Ultimately, again, because it was common. Ultimately, again, to worship these images on their own. Rashi says, Tavnis yad levada hein ovdin. It would be common sometimes to find idolaters worshiping just the image of a hand or the image of a foot. So therefore, those by themselves were theologically significant. Incredible. Says the Gemara, Amar Shmuel, afilu shivrei avodas kohavim. Shmuel says, so again, that's why I have to be very careful with our terms over here. Shivrei tzlamim means you find a broken piece of an image. Now again, I will say, what don't I know about this image? What don't I know about this image? What don't I know about it? I don't know, is it Avoda Zara or not? I have no idea. Shmuel, and that's why, again, remember, you have this sveka, right? You have this double suffix. Suffix number one, was it ever idolatry to begin with? And number two, even if it was idolatry, maybe it was actively decommissioned through breakage. Shmuel says something amazing. This same halacha applies even to broken idolatry. In other words, I come across, a piece of what I know was an idol. This was an idol that was worshipped for Avoda Zara. Shmuel says, the shvarim, ultimate, the shivrei of Azcham, the broken pieces are mutter. Now, both say, take a look at Rashi. Amar Shmuel afilu shivrei avodas kochavim lo tema shivrei tzlamim dafka mishum d'Hashem lo avdom me'olam afilu kishay shleimim afilu shivrei avodas kochavim sherainom sha'avdua kishahaisa shleima mutarin techevan denishbara shuv ein ovdin osa. Shmuel says like this: idolaters don't worship broken idols. They don't worship broken idols. So it's clear that once it's broken, they no longer worship it. And if they no longer worship it, therefore what? It no longer has theological significance. If it no longer has theological significance, it's mutter. Wild. Therefore, Allah Shmuel says not only is it shivrei slamim, but even shivrei avodas cham. So we'll say, so again, just get your terms right over here. Shivrei slamim just means broken images. Were those images ever used for Avoda Zara or not? We don't know. That's part of the sveka. Shmuel, and they're mutter. Mishnah says it's mutter. Shmuel says, same halacha applies to actually broken pieces of idols. Why? Once the idol breaks, the Avoda Zara no longer worships it. V'hanan tnan, shivrei slamim, but that's not what it says in the Mishnah. Right? The Mishnah says shivrei slamim, which means broken pieces of images, not avodas kochavim. To which the Gemara says, "Hu adin dafilu shivrei avodas kochavim." Really, the Mishnah means to teach me even broken pieces of idols. V'hadik tani shivrei slamim. So why does it say shivrei slamim? Mishum de kabay lemisna seifa matzah tavnis yad tavnis regel. No, so the Mishnah Dafka wanted to write shivrei slamim. Why? Because the Mishnah wanted to make a point in the end. What was the point in the end? That if you find a broken foot, right, the piece, right, just a foot, right, a foot, or you find a hand of an image, everyone agrees that is idolatry. And again, I will say, so in that case, even if I have no idea, was it worshipped, was it not worshipped, everyone agrees that in that case, people do worship that, therefore that is Avoda Zara. So it's now, let's analyze. So Mishnah says, Matzah tabnis, ya tabnis, elu asurim, mibnei shekiyot, say bo ne'evad. So we'll say, so the Mishnah said, if you find a foot, or you find a hand, ultimately, again, that is asr. Why? Because people worship that. So the Gemara says, amai, but why is it asr? Amud beis, v'ha shvarim minhu. But I will say that contradicts what we just said before, right? The Mishnah began by saying that broken pieces of idols ultimately again are mutter, right? Then it says that if you find the foot or you find the hand, it's asr. But I don't understand. A hand or a foot is a broken piece of an idol. So why is it asr? So also this is very interesting. Tirgum Shmuel ba'omdin al besisan. This is very interesting. I will say, what's the case? The case is where the hand or the foot is on a pedestal. It's on a pedestal. It's on a base. Rashi says al besisan al kanan makom hamatukan la kevon dozvinu hasam vade palchilu. If something is on a pedestal, then what? It's important. It's important. So it's very interesting. So stam, you find the foot or you find the hand of just a broken piece of an idol, it's not asr. Shmuel says, if you find that on a pedestal, that's chashuv, and that's when everyone will agree that it has theological significance. Itmar, so I'll say, let's analyze. So I'll say, this is a fascinating sugya. Itmar, avodas kohavim, shenishtara me'eleha. Listen to this case. You have an avodah zara thing. Avodah Zara, all right, an idol that broke on its own, whatever, it fell over ultimately again, and it broke. So we'll say, so what is its status? So we'll say, so again, just to give you the context over here, or just to give you the flow. So remember, Shmuel was of the opinion that even broken idols, which means stuff was actually worshipped for idolatry, once it breaks, it's mutter ba'ana. Why? Because Shmuel was of the opinion that once there are broken idols, by definition, the idolaters stop worshiping it. Now, Shmuel's coming from the perspective that if you find broken idolatry, you could assume that someone broke that. And if the idolater broke his idols, ultimately, again, obviously he's not worshiping them anymore. The Gemara now asks, what happens if the idol broke on its own? Right, so again, you saw the idol just tipped over, now it's broken. Do idolaters still worship that? In other words, do those pieces where the idol broke on its own, do those pieces have theological significance or not? So watch this. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Asura. Rabbi Yochanan says ultimately it is Asur. Right? Rabbi Shmuel Lakish Omer Muteres. Machlokes Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. So Rabbi Yochanan says Asur, Reish Lakish says Muter. Here we go. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Asura. Rabbi Yochanan says that it's Asur. Dehalo Batla. Again, I will say this is very interesting. In order for idolatry to stop being idolatry, there has to be an active negation. An active negation. Now, what does active negation look like? Active negation could look like a sledgehammer, right? Active negation could look like throwing it to the ground. Active negation could look like something that the akum himself is doing, right? In order to go ahead and show that he no longer worships this. But the idol falling over and breaking on its own, there's no active negation there. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, it's not mevater. Reish Lakish Amar Muteres. Reish Lakish says ultimately, again, it's muter, right? Why? Mistama batule mevatlale. So listen to this. Reish Lakish says, nah. Once the idol is broken, b'pashtos, the akum is mevatalit, right? He negates it. Why does he negate it? This is very interesting. Mimar Amar, ihi nafshelo atzla lahu gavra masdele. So listen to this, because the akum will say, listen, if the idol can't save itself, it's obviously not going to be that helpful to me. This is very Avram Avinu-esque, right? This is like the Medrash, right? Where Avram Avinu went ahead and, put the big club in the hand of the big idol, told his father that it smashed all the little idols. When his father said that it's impossible, he said, exactly. So therefore, Reish Lakish says, if the idol doesn't have the power to keep itself intact, then Allah Chaskama Vakama doesn't have the ability to watch over me. And therefore, again, Halacha L'maisa, Reish Lakish says, there's almost like an implied bittul. There's an implied negation if the idol itself breaks. So I will say, so really a fascinating machlokes over to Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish about how does one negate idolatry. Rabbi Yochanan holds there has to be active negation. Active negation. Reish Lakish says even passive negation, right? Or implicit negation. Or actually the way we would say it is de facto negation really works as well. See, the difference also is Rabbi Yochanan says you mamish need a maisa. Rabbi Shmuel says no, it can even be understood and implied. Quite fascinating. So Rabbi Yochanan is kasher Reish Lakish. Also, is fascinating. Berosh dagon ushtei kapos yadav krusos. So we'll say just a little bit of context over here. The Gemara is going over here from the story in Shmuel Aleph. We'll say this was the story where the Aron was taken by the Plishtim, right? This was the tragic story actually in the beginning of Shmuel Aleph, where again this is where the Klal Yisrael goes out to war. They make the mistake of taking the Aron with them. This is where the two sons of Eli HaKohen, Chafni and Pinchas, are killed in battle as well. Eli dies after hearing the news. A terrible, tragic story. The Aron was taken captive, right? The Aron was taken by the Plishtim. Now, I'll say the Plishtim put the Aron, because the Plishtim themselves also went ahead and respected, obviously, the sanctity of the Aron. So they, in their own way, so they put it in the temple of their god, who was called Dagon. Dagon, okay. So what happened? They put it in the Dagon temple. The next morning they walk in, and what do they find? That ultimately Dagon's head, his hands and his feet are cut off. That's what they find from Dagon. Uksiv, obviously what ended up happening is, and Dagon himself, or itself, toppled over. Okay, so the Gemara says, Uksiv, and the pasuk says, Al Kain lo yidruchu kohanei Dagon. Ultimately, again, therefore, the priests of Dagon would not walk on that area upon which the idol had toppled over. So Rabbi Yochanan says, what do you see from here? What do you see from here? That idolaters still ascribe meaning to their idol even after the idol is destroyed, right? They're still treating, you see, again, they wouldn't walk on the space where the idol toppled over out of deference to the idol. This is after the idol was, again, decapitated, hands were cut off, feet were cut off, yet they still gave covet to the idol. So Rabbi Yochanan says, what do you see from here? An idol is an idol until an akum actively is mevatel it. Says the Gemara, Amar lo misham raya, to Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan, come on, that's not a good raya. Hassam, this is fascinating, Shemanichin es hadagon, va'ovdin es hamiftan. So say, this is incredible. No. Do you know why they wouldn't walk on the area upon which the idol was lying? They stopped worshiping Dagon. What did they worship instead? They worshipped the ground upon which Dagon was lying. Why? Because I will say what they saw was, remember again, the whole way idolatry works is that you ascribe power to certain naturally occurring phenomenon, right? So they, in the idolaters' mind, what they said was like this: there was a Dagon god, and then there was like a floor god, right? Ground god. Ground god obviously was stronger than Dagon because Dagon is now lying on the floor. So they stopped worshiping Dagon and they started worshiping the ground upon which Dagon was lying. So in fact, what they had done was they transferred their theological allegiance ultimately, again, from the idol to the floor. I will say, by the way, if you want to see just in a nutshell the difference between what it means to be an Oved Avoda Zara and ultimately an Oved Hashem, this is exactly what it is. An Oved Avoda Zara, it's very simple. Who do you worship? Who do you worship? Who do you worship? Whoever is the winning team, right? You always go with the winning team. What does it mean to be an Oved Hashem? There's only one God for me. Whether I feel like I'm winning or I'm losing, whether I feel like I'm on top or I'm on the bottom, right? Ubechozos shimcha lo shachachnu. Kadosh Baruch Hu, whatever comes my way, one thing is clear, which is I am always by your side. I will never, ever forsake you. I feel like you're with me, or sometimes I feel like you're not with me. It doesn't make a difference. Whether you're with me or you're not with me, I'm always with you. That's what it means to be an Oved Hashem. So therefore, Reish Lakish says just the opposite. This proves my point. They stopped worshiping Dagon and they started worshiping the floor. The Gemara says as follows: the Amri Hachi Shavkua Israel Dagon Va'ase Isay Le'ala Mifta, because they said whatever this great supernatural force was, it left Dagon and ultimately now it vested on the floor. So the Gemara is a kasha. So what says Rabbi Yochanan? How do you decommission Avoda Zara? Rabbi Yochanan says active decommission, active bittul. Therefore, if the idol breaks on its own, it still is idolatry. Reish Lakish says no, even passive decommission, right? Anything that happens once the idol breaks, clearly no one is worshiping it anymore. Eisvei, the Gemara is the kasha. Hamose shivrei slamim hare elu mutarin. So again, I will say, what do we learn? If you find, this is our Mishnah, if you find broken pieces of an image, ultimately it's mutter. The Gemara says, ha, shivre avodas kochavim, lo. So, right, but what do you see from here? The Gemara says, you can infer from this, not like Shmuel, that if you find broken pieces of idolatry, that is not mutter ba'ana. Right? Why? Because in broken pieces of idolatry, you can't assume that it was actively decommissioned. So this supports Rabbi Yochanan, is a kasha Reish Lakish. The Gemara says, Tema, shivri avodas kochav masurin. Right? The Gemara says, rather say that shivri avodas kochav marasur, ela ema hot slumim. Sigmar says, lo. Sigmar says, ha shivri avodas kochav lo. So tema avodas kochav masurin, ela ema hot slumim atzman asurin. No. So don't read out shivri avodas kochavim. Rather, say that slumim themselves, the images themselves, ultimately are asur. Ustomak Reb Meir, and the stomach reflects the view of Reb Meir, because you must remember again, what did Reb Meir say? This is a previous Mishnah. What did Reb Meir say? Reb Meir says that every image is asur. Why? Because it's worshipped at least once a year. For Rabbi Yochanan, mid Reb Meir nishbu l'Rabbanan. So I must say now, so according to Rabbi Yochanan, the fact that Reb Meir understands this statement of the Rabbanan, Lav Amar Reb Meir, Slamim Asurim, Shivrei Slamim Mutarin. According to Rabbi Meir, who says that Slamim are Asurim, right? The images themselves are Asur, but ultimately, again, the broken pieces of the image are Mutar. The Rabbanan Avodas Kochavim Nami Hi Asura Ushvara Mutarin. Well, you say that according to the Rabbanan themselves, that although the idol itself is Asur, well, the Zara itself is Asur, but the broken pieces will be Mutar. So the Gemara says, Hachi Hashtaha Sam Emar Avdum, Emar Lo Avdum. So you must say, when it comes to Slumim, remember, there's a sex Sveka that's there. The sex, part of the sex Sveka, so what double Safek is, maybe the Selam itself is an image, the right Selam is an image, maybe it was worshipped, maybe it wasn't worshipped. Vimtim Selam Avdum, and if it was worshipped, Emar Bitlum. Maybe they negated it by breaking it. So again, this is what we said before. By slumim, the reason why the Mishnah said, or the Chum said that slumim are mutarim, or shivrei slumim are mutarim, is because there's a double suffix. Number one, maybe it was never worshipped, and even if it was worshipped, maybe it was actively broken, in which case halacha l'maisa it's mutar. Avodas kochavim vaday avdua miyemar debatla. But again, I both said with avodas kochavim, with idolatry itself, there's only one suffix, right? Right, because why? Because it was definitely worshipped. The shaila is, maybe it was batal or not. Maybe it was actively negated. Have safek. So the Gemara says, have safek, har safek vevadai, vein safek motze midei vadai. Ultimately, the Gemara says, in a case of regular idolatry, this is very interesting. In the case of slumim, the reason why, according to the Chachamim, ultimately, again, broken slumim are going to be mutter. Shivrei slumim are mutter is why? Svek sveka, double safek. What's the double safek? Number one, maybe it was never worshipped. But number two, even if it was worshipped, maybe it was actively decommissioned, ultimately, again, by the breakage. By Avoda Zara, if you find pieces of Avoda Zara, the Chacham will say that it's going to be Asur. Right? Why is that Asur? There's only one safek. Because again, number one, it was definitely worshipped. So what's the safek? Maybe it was decommissioned, but maybe it wasn't, right? In other words, it was actively decommissioned by breakage, and therefore, ein safek motze midei vadai. A safek, right? The safek cannot go ahead and change the definitive piece of information. So therefore, again, Allah Chamaisa, the Rabbanon will say that shivrei avodah zara ultimately, again, will be asra. The Gemara says, 1 second, is that true? Ve'ein safek motzi midei vadai. So we'll stop over here for today. This is the next sugya we're going to do about safek motzi midei vadai. Can one safek go ahead and change a vadai? So I just want to point out we're still in the middle, but what we are left with is a raging machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Ultimately, how can Avodah Zara be decommissioned? Rabbi Yochanan, ultimately, again, only through active breakage, active decommissioning. Reish Lakish, even circumstantial decommissioning. The idol breaks on its own. Ultimately, again, that decommissions the Avodah Zara as well. Halacha l'maisa, and a tremendous hashkafic message from this as well. Emir Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach. All right, God bless you. Have a great day, everyone.